Alright, today class, we are going to be talking about the transmission of infectious diseases. So again, this idea of how the disease gets from one person to the next, why it's contagious, how, basically the transportation of the pathogen. So, what you need to know, first of all, the method of transmission. Well, again, that's just the way the disease gets from one organism to the next. Now, it's broken down into two different categories, or two different types of transmission. The first is direct transmission, and this is the exchange of the infectious material from one organism to another susceptible organism or individual. It's done with either direct contact or what's called droplet spread. So a physical touch or a spray from a cough or sneeze or such that has the infectious material, that's direct transmission. Indirect transmission is an exchange of infectious material to a susceptible person by a source that acts only as a carrier. So how the person received it, that organism is only a carrier. It is not infected per se. It is not the originator of the disease. It is just transportation to a human, basically. So we're going to first talk about direct transmission. And again, it's probably the simpler of the two methods. Direct contact, okay, physical contact required. Okay, different types of infections that are spread this way are sexually transmitted infections, STIs, different skin infections, excuse me, like ringworm, where one person becomes infected and then within contact passes it not onto another. Very common during like the sport of wrestling, because people are coming in contact all the time. Those types of skin infections can happen and do happen. That's why hygiene and sanitation of the mats and clothes is super important during wrestling season. Different respiratory diseases as well, because you get the mucus maybe on your hands or on other objects that those people then touch. Droplet spread is gross. It's transmission through sneezing, coughing, or even when you simply speak and you have spray from your mouth going out into the air. These small droplets of mucus and water can suspend in the air for long periods of time, just kind of float and hang out there, which makes it really gross. But those contain infectious materials, and then you're passing it on to the next person. You don't need to write all this down, copy this. I just wanted you to see that out of the booklet here on page 362, the idea of direct transmission, different ones that are spread through direct contact. Again, athlete's foot, jock itch, ringworm, those are all fungus infections that one contact, physical contact is required to pass that on. MRSA, impetigo, and pink eye. Again, someone with pink eye touches their face and then touches yours, that becomes a problem. So, not that I really wanted you to know everything about those things right now, but just to see those are the ones that are direct contact. And then here are the ones that for droplet spread. Okay, and it's a lot of common ones that we see: the cold, flu, meningitis, pneumonia, strep throat, mono. Okay, that means your mucus, your saliva, whatever is infected in you, you sneeze, cough it out, spreads in the air, gets on objects, then someone else is touching it and then getting it into their body. Maybe just breathing it in, or you splatter them with your sneeze. Which is why I'm going to show you this video next. It's just a 40-second long of someone sneezing. Up here is the name of the researcher that did a significant amount of research on sneezing and the sprays of sneeze, how they travel, and what those effects are. But we're just going to take a little slow gander here at what a slow motion sneeze looks like. Okay, so that was significantly gross, but yes, that is what is happening during a sneeze. There is debris that you don't necessarily always know or see is there. Sometimes you do, and it's gross. But that's why, sneezing into your elbow or having a tissue when you sneeze, something to contain all that infectious material, because if someone's got a cold there, yes, all of that is getting everywhere, contaminating other people. All right. Now, indirect transmission, a couple different types we'll talk about here. First is by animal. All right, so if you become infected or a disease that is transmitted from animal to a person, the animal is called a vector. All right, so mosquitoes that can transport malaria to people, those would be called vectors. Zoonosis is the infection itself. All right. So, for instance, again, malaria can be one. Rabies is another common one for people around the world wide. Bitten by an animal, they become infected with rabies. That disease is a zoonosis. But animal to human, fairly common disease, especially when you're talking small insects, mosquitoes, worms. Okay. Very, very common worldwide. The next one is contaminated objects. Okay, food, water, medical devices, any other object that becomes contaminated, and then you somehow maybe puncture the skin or consume that into the body, you're now infected. Cholera is actually one of a very common worldwide water contamination, and it causes severe dehydration, basically destroys your body. People die from this worldwide, and it's a water contamination. All right, so here in the United States, we typically don't have to worry about water contamination that much. We don't worry about food contamination too much. Yes, we have salmonella outbreaks, other issues, but overall, our culture, our society, we have a system put in place that takes care of these things. Now we have breakdowns of this once in a while. So yeah, we'll have outbreaks of E. coli, salmonella once in a while that arise, but typically it's not something in our country that we have to overly concern ourselves with as other areas of the world do. Water sanitation itself has drastically reduced the amount of infectious diseases in our country, as well as how we dispose of human and animal waste. We have a very good sewer system, so there's don't always get contaminated, crossing from human waste to drinking water. So those systems that have been put in place drastically help reducing the contaminated objects, food and water. Now, food can be contaminated at any process along the way, at any time. Okay, it can be during the harvest, it could be how it's stored and not stored properly, the processing of the food, if it's being butchered, or just how the person in home prepares it. At any time, if it's not stored correctly, cleaned correctly, proper utilities or utensils that are used to cut or handle it aren't sanitized, or if you just don't cook it long enough, you now have set yourself up for contamination. So food as a whole, uh, can be very easily contaminated. So yeah, airborne. Okay, basically the pathogens are hitching a ride, kind of similar to droplet spread, but usually the dust particles that they're attached to. So there's dust everywhere in the air. Pathogens are hitching a ride on much smaller dust particles, and so these droplets can stay in the air suspended for very long periods of time. With gravity itself is not actually pulling these down, whereas a sneeze, yes, it's going to suspend, but a lot of that's going to be heavy enough to where gravity's going to pull it to the ground. Airborne, typically not. It's going to be in the air, stay in the air, and that's how we're going to breathe it in, respiratory, and have problems with it. Okay, now we have different occurrences of infectious diseases. Words here you may have seen before, heard, not totally known the difference. So we're just going to try to clarify what these are as we move forward. Okay, the first is an epidemic, and that's probably the one that gets used most commonly. But basically, it just comes down to an epidemic is, again, infectious diseases that are unexpected large numbers of it reported in a particular area. Okay, so this could be all the way down to your school. It could be your city, state, maybe your country. But just if there's an epidemic, hard to say the word, epidemic, then they did not expect such high numbers of reports of it. So this happens all the time with the flu. Like this year, the flu in the United States was horrible. We had an epidemic. People getting the flu maybe multiple times because they're getting different types. Lots of people dealt with the flu. It was a very harsh case of the flu this year. So that's an epidemic. Now, pandemic is enormous numbers. Okay, not just more than normal. It's an enormous amount of people become infected, and it spreads from one country to much of the world. Like Zika virus was one in the last few years. Bird flu, swine flu. Okay, all these different viruses that maybe you've heard from history here, recent history. They usually have an origin where they've started, and then because our country or our world is so interconnected now and people traveling everywhere all the time, it starts to spread faster. So when that begins to happen, that's a pandemic. Okay, becoming much more worldwide. Endemic are naturally occurring low levels in a particular area. This is what we expect. We know this is going to happen. For instance, the cold. With people, especially in the United States, where it gets cold at times in the winter, we just expect, people are going to deal with the cold. Other countries have their own things that they deal with on kind of a seasonal basis as well. But that's endemic. It's not something that's spreading worldwide. People can't handle. It's just that's the naturally you expect that to happen. Now, that is all I have for today. Tomorrow's lesson is going to be based on prevention. So we've seen how these are transmitting, direct, indirect methods. And so tomorrow is going to be looking at how do we keep that from spreading. All right, thank you.